So we did. Yeah, we don't know about Starsky and Hutch. Hello. This is Mitch Hampton, Journey of an Aesthete podcast, and we have a very, very special episode, but not the way they use the term special in the TV of your episode, because we have two guests that have a great podcast that everybody should listen to, and it's called the Lawn 70s Podcast. And it's happening, and it's heavy, and it's about what's happened and where we are, how we ended up where we are today. And there's so much to talk about. So I want to invite on this podcast. The guests are Alex and Matt. Hi, Matt.
Hello.
And Alex, I think, is slightly older, correct? Hi, Alex.
Hello. Actually, Matt and I are pretty close in age.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought maybe one was a Gen Xer and one was a millennial, but
oh no, we're both Gen Xers.
Okay, so we're all in the same. Okay, so yeah, I'm probably the oldest one here, being 50, just turned 56 last week.
Yes.
So
yes.
I just listened to your rollerball episode.
Okay.
That was a fun one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not only is it fun, but what's funny is a lot of the movies that you cover on your show are movies I saw as a little boy.
Oh, lucky you.
In theaters. So I saw Rollerball on 42nd Street with my dad, when I was maybe 6 years old. I saw The Crazies in a drive-in. I saw
right.
And I saw Rabid with Marilyn Chambers as a child too, I think I saw that in Tampa, and so it's interesting to listen. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's great to listen to these shows. But I guess I should start with some basic questions about, I'm a 70s scholar, lay scholar. You guys both are. You guys care about the 70s, or interested in the 70s, as am I. You guys had Bruce Schulman on your show. I had Bruce Schulman on my show, and I was actually one of the first people to discover his work in 2001. And I actually did a story on him in his book back then for a newspaper and covered it. And so it's interesting to see his journey and our journey. But talk a little bit first of all, how you got interested in the 70s as a concept and as a aesthetic, political, spiritual, historical entity. And then talk a little bit about how that developed into this wonderful podcast. Whoever wants to go first is.
So we're actually we're not lucky enough to have Bruce actually as a guest on the show.
Oh, okay.
So you definitely got one up on us on that. We'd love to have him on, but we haven't had any way to contact him.
Oh,
and but we've been
I'll try to rectify that. I'll try to mention
that would be great. But I think we're probably about 8 or 9 years younger than you.
Mm-hmm.
So we really didn't experience the 70s proper in any kind of an adult way. Like we didn't get to see those movies. My dad, who introduced me to movies and music, was a little more into the early 80s stuff, and then the 60s, like soul. And so I think, I won't speak for Alex, but I think we got into the 70s in high school as like it seemed like vintage then, even though it was, closer to when we were in high school than when we were in high school as to now, which is kind of mind blowing. But
I mean, when you mention high school, that's a 70s that opens up so much 70s artistic culture, right? Whether it's Rock and Roll High School or Animal House that's college. But I mean, sort of on the edge, over the edge with Matt Dillon, and just all those movies come rushing to my consciousness hearing you mention that it's in high school. Now, I was in high school, so I got interested in the 70s in high school. And it was actually, no, I'm sorry, not high school. Scratch that. Freshman year in college, which is close.
Right.
And I had a roommate, and I had a dream about the 70s. I had this weird dream that, that I had traveled back 4 years, and I was in a Pinto or something. And there was some kind of there was some kind of a drive-in movie, and it was with my dad. And there were the kids that used to hang out and they used to sit on the dashboard of Mustang, convertibles and these Pontiacs, these kind of cars. And they would smoke weed. And of course I was a boy. I was not, doing anything like that then. And, but they were pretty liberal, and and I used to watch the adult, the adults grown up and things like that. And I woke up from this dream, and I told my roommate at the time, Randy, he says, Mitch, you had a dream about the 1970s. So it's kind of weird that, in 85, this would have been, people were already thinking about the 70s as a concept. I've spoken too long, but go. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, that makes a lot of sense because, as you get into the mid 80s, pop culture takes a different direction. So people look back at the 70s fondly. But I think we were just really into 70s music and movies in high school. But really, I didn't get into the history of the 70s until much, much later when I went back to school. And I took a class on the 70s, on 70s history in the 2000s. And it was based on Schulman's book.
Yeah, well, isn't his book become a standard text in most colleges or most universities? Isn't it kind of like a classic? No, I think it is.
Yeah, I mean, it should be if it's not.
It is, yeah, and I think it's much to him. I mean, I'm happy for him because that means sales for his book. And
yeah,
it is.
Happy
to hear that.
It is definitely hard to find an actual class on this time period, though. In the university, they tend to peter out in the 60s, and then they kind of consider everything that came after as an afterthought.
Yeah. Well, they do it. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You talk.
Oh, no, I was just going to say. Plus, the 70s gets trashed on so much. It's such like low hanging fruit for people to say, oh, the fashions were terrible and the economy was terrible and this, that, and the other. So it's easy for a lot of that. People making a big deal about the late 60s and all the social change, and then the 70s just gets treated like this sort of disposable decade. So
and of course, as Bruce mentions in his very opening paragraph, people laugh at it. People say it's uneventful. And he goes on to deliver his thesis and ours. Au contraire, it's the most eventful, the most significant period of time in every way, and it's not just a joke. It's not just pet rocks and
right. Yeah. Right. So his book really was kind of the genesis of the podcast. Probably, I don't know, 5-10 years later, I brought it up with Alex. It had been kind of going around in my head. And really, over the past 4 years, we've pretty much done a deep dive on Schulman's book. I mean, we actually haven't gone through much of his actual arguments because I've always kind of felt like that was his thing. He makes great arguments in that book as to why the long 70s is important, like 68 to I think he actually says maybe 82. But
84 maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. But
we treat that. We have like sort of hard
you guys deal with that
and ends for ours.
Yeah, you guys deal with that very issue in every episode. For example, when you're covering movies from the early 80s.
Yeah.
And you mentioned like, well, this risky business or this film, or you mentioned the first season of an 80s show it says everybody looks sort of 70s, like Cheers, right? That Shelley Long's outfit or Ted Denson's wearing an elephant collared shirt, in the first season or something like that. Or and it reminds me a lot of things like that. And how the early 80s is really the same as the 70s and how it's kind of and with movies too. Think about a movie like Used Cars, right, from 1980 with Kurt Russell.
Right.
Jack Warden. That movie is so 70s about those used car sales. There's just nothing 80s about it remotely. You know, it's funny that its director would become Mr. 80s with Back to the Future, only if you directing back
people use, I think, decades as sort of a shorthand. When people talk about the 60s, they're talking about like typically the last couple of years of it, unless it's something very specific like JFK or Marilyn Monroe or something like that. But they're typically talking about the last couple of years. And by that token, the 70s, there's often an aesthetic they're talking about. So if you show people like the first season of Cheers or something from Different Strokes, for example, that was in the 80s, people will look at like the hairstyles of the kids or the clothing, and they'll say, oh, that show must have started in the 70s. It's like, no, it's just, it just hadn't become like the calculator watch and the neon colors of the mid 80s yet.
Yeah.
You're still in browns and you're still in
right.
tan.
Yeah. The earth tones.
And people have a lot of hair. It's amazing to me.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me, these 14, 15-year-old kids in some of these high school movies made during that period, how much hair everybody had. I don't know, just something in the water. Just, I don't know. They just nobody ever got a haircut ever. Their parents never got the haircut. You look at Adam Rich and Haynes enough, that I had that same haircut, by the way. Every boy that was his age, every 7-year-old was forced by their mother usually to have that bowl cut that what is it called? A bowl cut? Some kind.
Yeah, the bowl cut.
Bowl cut when I had that hair, and you look at pictures of that hair, and it's like, you look
I think
at
people hadn't figured out how to style long hair all that much. Like it was still coming out of the idea of like guys growing out their hair. That was still kind of making a statement.
That's right.
Up to a certain point. So there isn't a lot of style to it. It's just like, hey, look, I didn't cut my hair. You know, I didn't cut my sideburns either, you know. So
right.
Some of that just comes from like the not maintaining any of that, just letting it go.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you mentioned that because it's interesting that these two podcasts linked up because a big part of how I view this like time period, this little epoch is in aesthetic terms.
Oh, of course.
It's really one cohesive aesthetic over these years, 68 to 84. And then there's a drastic shift after. And even before, even, you know, from 67 to 68, there's definitely a shift. And
there is.
So there's just something that you can feel about it that's different than the preceding and following periods.
Well, I see it as a feeling that's hard to articulate. You know, like you guys are really, see, you two gentlemen in every episode, I'm just going to use examples.
Sure.
You approach like a topic. And like I just, you know, one of the most recent things I listened to, the two were the Rajneesh.
Yeah,
right.
About the very unusual, sort of strange, new religious sort of spiritualist movement that had downsides and upsides for you know, for the people in it.
Right.
And then what was the other? You had one. Was it Firefox or about Red Dawn? There was another.
Yeah, Firefox and Red Dawn.
And then there was something about the 80s or something. But so my point, not to be too circulatory circles, is that when you talked about this Rajneesh phenomenon, you guys did something I wish every podcaster would do. Like what I mean is that you kind of, well, first of all, you didn't just jump into it. It's a very subtle thing. And you kind of start, and this is probably how, Matt, I think you introduce it usually, and then Alex, you start with like these facts, you know?
Often that's how the breakdown is.
Right. But when you do the breakdown, I had just watched that Netflix documentary, I think a year ago it dropped. And I was thinking, I actually liked your episode more than that film. It's strange. I thought,
wow, that's nice.
Well, because the reason is that I think that film had more of an agenda. It's about the agenda up front.
Sure. Right.
Yeah. And it seems to be like in a show, you try not to do that, or rather you do it subtly, or it's not. You're more about sort of reaching a conclusion from the facts given.
Right.
Yeah. I think what happened is early on, I mean, the show has evolved over time. Early on, since you said you've listened to most of them, they tend to be more like lectures. And that's kind of how I envisioned it at first, very informative and factual. But then I think we realized over time that was kind of boring. And so at some point we switched over to a different way of doing it where like a lot of these things are not necessarily, they're not like occult topics. They're things people know about. But, and so if people want to just know about the movie Rollerball, they can just watch the movie. Sure. So we try to bring in some additional, just kind of personal insights.
Oh, absolutely.
That you can't just get by watching the movie or reading a book about movies. And so that's kind of the angle we've taken. And so we definitely try to add a little extra context and insight in every episode. And at this point, it's been so long and so many episodes. It just kind of happens. Well, I don't know about Alex, but I'll watch a movie.
Yeah, sure.
And I can almost not enjoy it because I'm constantly making connections and thinking, you know, this is really strange. What this is just like that other movie.
Sure.
Or like this is different than a movie from 1965 in this way.
Right. Well, that's a natural thing to do. I think we all do that if we're literate, what I would call culturally literate, with, you know, kind of a minimal amount of literacy. You know what I mean? As opposed to not knowing anything about any movies or, you know, that kind of thing. So That's a natural
Yeah.
thing. I think everybody does, either unconsciously or consciously. But I was struck, you brought up very contemporary things. I don't know if it was in that episode, but you mentioned Refn, one of my favorite filmmakers, is Neon Demon and
Yeah.
Too Old to Die Young, I think, and
yes, that's one of his.
But you made a critical thing, like what Refn lost me in a particular season. This sort of Henry Winkler, Fonzie jumping the shark concept from Happy Days, right? But well, that's really, I was on for the entire ride. I mean, it gets very weird. I mean, to be fair, Too Old to Die Young is a very strange film. It may be his strangest film, more strange than Neon Demon, more strange in terms of, right? You would agree. And it's it's a very abstract film. It's not just a crime film, and it's not just a, it's something else going on in there. And it's takes some difficulty, but you might be right. Maybe there's a sense in which it lost its, course, or,
I think this is an example of the fact that we didn't come into the show as experts on the time period. We've been learning as we go along.
Oh yeah.
Especially for me, a lot of what I say is really what I'm thinking at the moment. And
absolutely.
I a lot of the older episodes, I can't even remember what we talked about. So,
well, if you ask me, I'll tell you. But you're talking about the joy of discovery. So maybe that's the secret to your show and shows like it, if there are shows. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a big podcast expert, but I think that your approach is sort of like, that's why I say it's literate, but it's not. You're right, expert, but literate without being expert. So it's sort of like you're on this journey.
But
and we're doing the journey with you, and that's what's interesting.
Well, that's good to hear. That's kind of that was the goal.
Yeah.
But, Too Old to Die Young, I've since changed my mind. It's definitely my favorite, and I think probably I just didn't quite get it the first time, and since then I've come to appreciate it a lot more. It's probably one of my favorite seasons of television ever, and probably up there with, I know both Alex and I are fans of True Detective season 1.
Right.
Yeah.
I should interject. Have you guys watched Glow yet? Speaking of 70s and 80s.
No, I haven't.
No, I've heard of it, but I
can't recommend enough Glow. I mean, Glow is about all the themes that you talk about on your podcast, because it takes place in 84 and it's about a women's wrestling team. And, and it's Alison Brie and Mark Maron and it's a reconstruction of that era. It's just such a good series. I just recommend it.
We'll have to check that out.
It would be interesting to hear if you did an episode on it, how you would treat that.
Well, that would be an interesting one, because I never really got into wrestling as a kid either. So this would be that's
the thing about the series, is that you could actually know nothing about wrestling nor be a fan and love this series, because it's actually about actors who need a job, who themselves aren't even wrestlers, and they sort of fall into it. So the TV show is about universal themes of being a performer and trying to work, and the culture of the 80s. So it's much more than just it's wrestling. It's not a show. I don't think the show was intended to be for wrestling fans or Betty Gilpin.
You know what's interesting about the 70s is it's a real gold mine for television shows.
Oh, absolutely.
In a way that the 60s and the 80s, the other two big pop culture decades, really haven't been. Alex, what's that?
Yes.
That Showtime show that you liked so much, the one about Times Square, like the
Deuce.
Yeah.
Well,
the Deuce is great.
That's well done.
It is.
Yeah.
I mean, Deuce is really doing different things. I mean, Alex, when did you first see it? Because didn't you have the feeling watching it that, is it David Simon and James Franco and
Franco for sure. It's been a while since I've seen it. I actually saw it. I kind of jump around streaming platforms.
What's it?
A lot.
I'm sorry. That's right. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say I jump around streaming platforms a lot. I don't necessarily have one forever and ever. I kind of like watch it, and then I kind of run out of the shows or run out of the trial period, and I want to try something else. So I haven't actually seen The Deuce for a while, but I do remember seeing it when it's fairly new, because once I saw what the topic was, I was like, oh, that sounds like something I definitely want to check out. you know, and it was well done. And of course, you know, television is something that has definitely improved. Like, and that's already like a trope to talk about, is like how ever since, you know, like The Wire or The Sopranos or whatever, TV has like gotten light years ahead of where it used to be from just, you know, any of your metrics. So the point is I thought The Deuce looked pretty good, and it was right on brand. And it was interesting too, because I do remember like in the news when they talked about like Times Square getting cleaned up, I think in the 90s, you know, so it was interesting to see Times Square like at its low point.
Right. Well, low point. It's interesting. I was living in New York City as a child during that time. I mean, because my parents, it's a long story. Parents had a family business, and they had a second home in New York City, two places. So if I wasn't in Tampa, Florida, I was in New York City. And so, you know the marquees in that, like in the Deuce, remember the marquee of the bird with the crystal plumage and the contrast?
It's funny, I've seen that, but I don't. It's funny, I don't think I recognize them together.
I took a photo of that because it was striking that they chose the actual movies playing. I think it was in the movies.
I wonder. I bet I noticed that when I watched it and just forgot it, because I remember that was like the first. I think that was the first Giallo I saw. So yeah, and of course the titles are unforgettable. You know, they totally sound like something that's been run through like a translator program. You know, when you read the English versions of them,
absolutely,
they've got these sort of like kind of long, cumbersome things. You know, 4 Flies on Gray Velvet or whatever. So.
Well, that's a good one too. I mean, those are really interesting movies. I mean, it's just, what I'm saying is that you have a feeling when you see that marquee. I'm actually brought back to being a kid, it's probably a little bit like Tarantino's memories, maybe, because he, like me, I'm only comparing myself to him in one way, is that he consumed R-rated culture as a child.
Sure.
And so reading his memoir was about movies is really so resonant with me, because I saw all those drive-in movies and all those things. I didn't see them in California. He saw them in Torrance.
Sure.
But it's very similar.
That's funny that you mentioned earlier, you talked about having a dream about being at a drive-in, because one of my early memories was going to a drive-in with my dad and us seeing Escape from New York in the drive-in. And I just remember my dad later, he was almost kind of apologetic about it, because like we saw it at a drive-in at night and the whole movie is at night. So like as a kid, I remember like just being like, it's kind of hard to tell what's going on. Everything's dark, you know? So... Wasn't
Escape in New York one of those movies that's really a 70s movie?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think it's from technically 82, but we definitely, I don't think we've done a freestanding episode on it, but we've definitely name checked it here and there. I think some of it is interesting when you start to see, like, we always joke about sort of the technology in it. Like Kurt Russell's got guns in there that just have like lasers and battery packs and scopes and stuff just bolted every which way on them. So it's already sort of like there's like a technophile aspect to that, even in an action movie. And then you'd see that later on.
I used to do film festivals.
Action movies.
I used to do film festivals at my house in the 80s and VCRs and invite friends over. And one of my double features was the Fort Apache, the Bronx, and Escape from New York.
Oh yeah. That's a fun time.
Yeah, Fort Apache, the Bronx with Pam Grier and goodness, Paul Newman. Wow.
I think that's why when we do movies, I always set the outer limit of the long 70s at 85, because really there's I just feel like as soon as the John Hughes movies came out and Temple of Doom came out, everything just shifted. In a way, I think you've seen recently the last 20 years with the move to the big Marvel blockbusters and kind of this hollowing out of the mid-budget movies. All those smaller, fun action movies kind of fell away.
Yeah.
And those are the best ones.
Well, they are. That's really true. But what we're trying to articulate to you is that shift. So what is that shift? I mean, you can use examples. It's sort of the shift from used cars, I guess the cynicism and the black humor of it, the two brothers and the scams and all that, and the wildness of the clothes and the polyester jackets and the used car lot. And same director, you go to Back to the Future, and there's just a big change. And is it a change in? Is it just basically a change to some kind of optimism, or sort of a little more? Is it just more sunshiny, or is it just kind of just as simple as that? Is sort of a, or is it part of the whole Reagan zeitgeist, or the whole? You know what I mean?
I think it's both.
Got to be part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that it's a shift in the zeitgeist. I think that
And
in
the
a
aesthetic.
way, yeah, there's like a deliberate effort to change the aesthetic to be new and kind of aimed at a different generation. We've talked a bunch of times about how all of a sudden movies became targeted at teenagers in a way they never were before. The teenagers were the heroes. The parents were stupid,
right?
Like Ferris Bueller, all the John Hughes movies, really, and but it also has to do with an attitudinal shift and this kind of culture-wide attempt to like revitalize just like the America of, it's not even really the America of old, it's really the America of like World War II, essentially.
Absolutely. And it just occurs to me now is maybe it's a return to something older. So maybe, and by that I don't mean World War II. Maybe it's a return to another 60s, like the 60s of Robert Kennedy's campaign.
Oh yeah,
Camelot and Jack Kennedy. Maybe it's like a boomer idea of that kind of positive outlook, but the 80s Reagan-esque, non-liberal, conservative version of that. I don't know. I'm thinking out loud. I don't know. It's sort of a weird, like funhouse mirror. So it's the same sensibility. And that is about uplift always, it's kind of uplift,
Yeah, it's an optimism as opposed to a pessimism. I mean, you can't help but watch long 70s movies and appreciate the kind of general pessimism and dystopia.
Sure.
And, a lot of the, like the grittiness that people talk about that makes 70s movies so great is this kind of pessimism, and it's dirty and it's crime ridden and things are dark and gritty. And it was almost a deliberate turn away from that to now everything's going to be neon and shiny and hairspray.
Right. And it's going to be like Leah Thompson's hair, right? And,
right. Yeah.
I mean, she has a gorgeous head.
There's a lot of that dystopian flavor too. Like you were mentioning that. It's even in science fiction. We recently did an episode on Alien, for example, and that's just all about like this very grungy sci-fi, but you see it in other movies too, whereas I think you'd mentioned Back to the Future. It's funny that by the time you get to this movie that is like very much a mid-80s movie, like they lean into the technology in just a positive way. Like everything from like Marty McFly plugs his guitar into some giant amp that like blows him across the room. And that's just a cool thing that you could do if you had a guitar. And I mean, nobody was really doing it, but like you could, or like the car that can travel time, and just stuff like that. Like it was like the optimism from technology as opposed to just like the world is changing and things are getting worse.
That reminds me, did you gentlemen see the DeLorean documentaries that came out a couple of years back on what, or the film?
I wanted to, I never did.
Yeah, I saw the documentary because it does relate, of course, to Back to the Future. It makes me think of, because of his entrepreneurial,
There's a new thing on that too. Have you seen that? I don't know if it's a Hulu thing or a Prime. I think it's got maybe, I want to say Jason Sudeikis and some people in it. It's called like Driven, and I think it's another DeLorean or DeLorean adjacent thing.
I'm thinking about the movie Cutter's Way. I don't know why. I mean, it could be that like a movie like Cutter's Way. Have you guys seen Cutter's Way?
No.
Oh wow. So I'd love to see you guys do a show on Cutter's Way. That's like 1981, and that's a movie that's both 70s and 80s, and there are things like that sort of feel like a hybrid,
Yeah, let me put that on the list.
It's Jeff Bridges, and it's about John Hurd, a Vietnam vet. And about political conspiracies and assassinations, and it's really good. Really,
it sounds perfect.
Yeah, it's
interesting. You bring up bringing the Vietnam vets into the movies like after the war was like very much over. We've talked about that on the podcast before, and also there's an interesting chapter. There's a book on the Vietnam War that I like a lot. I think it's called When the Domino Fell or Where the Domino Fell. It's one of those two. Anyhow, it's got a great chapter about like the portrayal of the Vietnam vet, like into the 80s. And that's what's kind of, you get everything from like First Blood, but you also get, I think there's a movie called Coming Home. I'm doing this from memory, so I'm probably getting this.
Coming Home is Hal Ashby's masterpiece from 1977. John Voight.
Exactly. So like once the movies were no longer about the war because it had become history at that point, but like the people who were in it and like how they got portrayed. And I think that's just like an interesting like postscript to just talking about Vietnam.
Absolutely. And I think that's certainly, but you folks have covered, but I want to go back to this Rajneesh again, because I think it's interesting. So if I didn't know who they were, like my parents were in the natural products industry. And my dad invented the United States' very first all natural organic cosmetic.
What was that?
It was called Aubrey Organics.
Right.
And it was the first of its kind, before Rachel Perry, before Body Shop, before, I mean, those guys stole from my dad basically. So, and then Whole Foods came in, and then it was, the rest was history, literally. But what I'm saying is that it's interesting because I was in that industry. I met so many people who knew people who went to Oregon. So many people. In fact, I even dated a woman briefly who had all of OSHA's books. That was like her love guru, and we would, not to get too intimate here, explicit, but she was always turning me on to OSHA says this and says that.
Sure.
But she herself never went to Oregon, but it made me think it's the connections between things. And in a way, the way you covered that phenomenon was the way it should be covered, because I think you should cover things, again, as I said before, subtly. You don't want to beat the audience over the head. And you also you want the audience to reach their own conclusions. And you were sort of grappling with like, well, what is a cult and what is a new religious movement and what, so it's interesting to hear about these people and know about a little bit from the inside, knowing people that did go to extremes or did do in their spiritual paths. They made decisions, like that.
Yeah.
We've covered a bunch of those too. So I think we always just try to kind of let things speak for themselves. Plus it's like, we're not out here to moralize or whatever. I mean, people can come to their own conclusions. By the time we've also, I think, read up on and kind of prepped for an episode, like you kind of feel like you start to get to know some of these people. And, I don't know, it's hard we're not going to demonize something when there's just an interesting story in there just to get out.
Unless you have to
work through.
Well, but unless there's a lot of demonization that's not maybe required or called for in some of these groups. I mean, have you folks?
Sure, of course, if it's something truly terrible.
I know you did the Love Family, but have you guys tackled Children of God at all in any of you?
No,
and I know that's a different. Yeah, that's on a different level, and of course, I'm not gonna. Yeah, I wouldn't give any sort of like, moral equivalency between some of these. We've just happened to pick some that did have more of a mixed record and weren't all one way. But some of them are truly terrible.
The Children of God is one of the egregious ones, almost like a center, like because of the pedophilia, of course, and also many celebrities grew up in it, like the Phoenix family were involved in that, and other celebrities. I'm blanking actress.
Rose McGowan
McGowan, I think all these poor kids had to grow up in that. But online there was an FBI website. I highly recommend that they collected all the cartoons and illustrations of their guru, Berg, I think his name was.
Yeah.
You've seen that, all these like Jesus tracks and all these, and they're weird, kind of a really fucked up form of Christianity, just basically his own, just awfulness and all these cartoons. And it's really, I'm not offended by many things, but I have to say that FBI website kind of was disturbing.
Oh yeah.
And I think that would be a perfect episode though, because it is that is a 70s phenomenon, that church and that group, if anything is,
Yeah. We're about to tackle Jonestown.
Wow.
People's Temple. And in some ways, I think we try to steer away from the really dark stuff and the really, I feel like we need to do Jonestown because it just has to be done. But at the same time,
Sure.
I'm not entirely sure what unique insight we can bring to Jonestown. It's been
Sure.
gone over. Children of God is kind of the same
Very much
in
so.
that I almost feel like we would just spend the whole episode just talking about how terrible it is. And I don't know if I could. I don't know what that says about the long 70s. And
Well, I have some theories. I mean, we can just trade theories if you want.
Sure.
I do have ideas about why it got that bad at times and what that means. I mean, I think so. Have you folks read, as part of your research, Deborah Layton's book, like Seductive Embrace? Or
no, we haven't gotten into
that's
that.
kind of a must. I mean, you guys always have reading lists on your episodes, and so that would be. I would try to find a copy of Seductive Embrace, because Deborah Layton was one of the people that got out of the escape to suicide, and
in Jonestown. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah, I may have read some of that. I forget. We haven't done an episode on it per se, but I know that we've both, or at least just speaking for myself, like I've done a lot of reading on it just because, I mean, it's fascinating. It's a fascinating story anyway.
Well, Deborah Layton is a really brilliant, she's just a good writer. I mean, I think she's also, is she a therapist too? I think. I don't know. She might counsel people that have been in damaging groups or toxic groups. And I think that's very important. But my theory is this. So I think, it's actually really simple. So the 70s is predicated on all 70s things. And I've been doing series on movies and on my show about 70s cinema. It's predicated on one proposition, that if you feel it and you undergo it, you must share it with the world and express it, whatever it is.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And it's kind of like getting in touch with your feelings. Now, if you think about it, that could be really, really valuable, but it can also lead you into hell and others into hell, because a lot of stuff inside of us we probably should not share or express.
Right.
Never mind making what occurs to us in the spur of the moment, making it into a religion or into a political movement. But in the 70s, people did that. They took everything, all the stuff in them, and they, in a way, did not edit it or they didn't self-censor, and they just expressed it so I see all these problems emerging from that proposition. And I see these religious movements like this Rajneesh thing. I see all over that kind of his thing of like, we must do this and we must have multiple spouses. Why? Because I want to, or because, this kind of insanity, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, that's true. That is definitely a characteristic of kind of the boomer generation. And not that it's inherent in them, but that's just kind of how they were created by pop culture. And then I think that's why the cynicism of Gen X is so pronounced, because it's a response to their parents.
We're
right.
This reminds me, because earlier in this episode that we're doing now, you mentioned that people like to trash 70s aesthetics. Well, they like to forget us. We're the invisible middle children, right? As Gen X.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
And so maybe maybe part of our rebellion is being overlooked, maybe, or kind of, they use phrases like latchkey and all this kind of stuff. I don't know if that's all. Maybe it does apply very much.
Yeah,
I guess it does. I don't know what you folks feel about your growing up, but do you think in a way we're kind of in a rebellion? Well, first of all, we're not really in rebellion. Kind of Gen X is about not rebelling in a way.
Right.
And
right.
We're not really conformist nor rebel. We're like sort of none of the above. We're kind of like, well, we don't want to conform and we don't want to rebel. We just kind of want to survive and get from day to day. Much more, I think we're more practical than boomers, I think, if I risk us over generalization.
Yeah, which is, in some ways, kind of sad, because we don't necessarily get to partake in that fun optimism and extravagance of behavior, but it also does offer some insight into why a lot of Gen X people don't get heavily involved in anything. They're not necessarily joiners in the way that baby boomers were, and the following generations tend to be,
Right.
because I think they kind of saw the extravagance of the 70s in a
Well,
way.
we saw the, for lack of a better word, excess of the 70s.
Sure.
Right.
Excess of emotional, I would call it emotional exhibitionism.
Yeah.
But I'm always mindful, because I have friends that are actors and studied acting, or professional actors, and of course I know about repression being a negative thing. So I'm always mindful that it is good to be in touch with your feelings. It's valuable, and I think, it's not bad.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a question of balance. I don't know. I don't know what you.
I don't know. Although Gen X was kind of given its own excesses, they just take a different form. You have the older Gen Xers who got to experience like the excess of the late 80s.
Oh yeah.
And but then when you get into the early 90s, the excess takes a much more internal kind of aspect, and you see, in pop culture, the glamorization of heroin, and
Oh yeah.
like the grunge scene,
Sure.
the idea of just basically self-destruction as creative endeavor.
Sure. Also, the coolness of apathy.
Right. Yeah.
There's a line there's a book by Chuck Klosterman called The 90s, and there's a line
You just read my mind. I was going to bring
he's got all kinds of great insights, but there's a line in there I paraphrase, and I'm paraphrasing it because I don't have the book in front of me, but he talks about how basically in the 90s that to do performative outrage was a bad look, that just wasn't part of the what people did. So there was sort of that like Gen X shrug that was
so maybe
perfected.
It just occurs to me now, maybe what Chuck Klosterman is describing the 90s is the 90s was the brief 10 years where we, Alex, Matt, me, had some say over things. And so what I mean is that because we were young adults then, and we had some little more power, and so maybe our idea is, hey, enough with the protesting, enough with and also, as he says, you don't have to care. It's like, it's not mandatory.
Sure.
Yeah.
There's a real sad aspect to his book, The 90s, because sad that he's mourning an era in which you weren't forced, in which things weren't compulsory.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah.
And we live in the age now, as you know, where everything is compulsory and mandatory. Like you have to do X, Y, and Z, and it's just so different.
Right. That's a good point.
Although, interestingly, Alex is the one who brought this to my attention. The 90s were actually the birth of the kind of modern anarchist movement.
Sure.
And he has this, I think, I'm not going to speak for you, Alex, but he has this publisher he likes called Crime Think that.
Oh, sure.
they started, I believe, in the 90s, maybe the 80s, but definitely big in the 90s, where they would publish books and pamphlets about how to steal.
Oh yeah.
How to squat. And
that's it's interesting where they come out of. Yeah, you're right, because it's tricky, because some of it is very like kind of culture jamming, sort of cut and paste, and just like, it's kind of a challenge to follow it, because it reminds me a lot of, I don't know if you guys remember this or if you ever followed it, but there used to be a magazine that you could find, and I think they were even like out at the checkout lanes, that was called Adbusters.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Well, Adbusters, I mean, the person that published Adbusters was one of the creators of Occupy Wall Street.
Okay. That makes sense.
Same people,
of course.
Right. Yeah.
So, but there's a very similar like philosophy and aesthetic between something like Adbusters and like the Crime Think catalog there. But you're right. It's an interesting, it is interesting how there was sort of that like Matt said, the anarchism that came out of that. Plus, too, you have like just speaking for one of the authors that I'm familiar with who has a book in that, where you had this stuff that grew out of like punk rock culture. So you had this idea of like veganism, really kind of flowering, like the melding of like veganism and hardcore punk rock, and that sort of thing. And that was something that definitely got big. Like there were bands, I think, that were probably came out of the 90s that like brought those things together.
I mean, I think
sort of associated with that.
Yeah, well, those. So I see hardcore punk and.
I mean, they came out of way back than that, but like a particular strain of it.
Right, but in addition to that, I see them as in part 70s. So I see them.
Sure, yeah, where it started, yeah. But by the time you had these like sort of vegan strains of it, that was like, you know, second generation hardcore. You know, some of these bands, they were really bands, I think, of the 90s as much as anything. You know, they were like another generation that you know, was doing its own thing then. So, but that's just, again, I think part of that like kind of anarchist thing. It was a weird time though, because you're also talking about a decade that they didn't really have wars as we would understand them. Like it was pre 9/11 and post Vietnam.
Oh God, I mean the 90s was
that.
You know, well, Klosterman talks about one that was the last great good decade of affluence and relative affluence and prosperity and peace. And we've got, I mean, think about Bill Clinton hanging out with Yasser Arafat and Prime Minister of Israel and shaking hands and laughing. That's not what we're seeing now within the Middle East.
No, not at all.
And so I couldn't. So we, you know, forgive me if I maybe kind of have a little bit of nostalgia for parts of the 90s. But you know, this kind of thing you're talking about, the so that kind of radical politics that anti-WTO.
Exactly. Yeah, the battle in Seattle.
Well, here's what's interesting about that. I think it's a contradiction, because on the one hand, it does have these 60s, 70s roots, and that it's far left, it's left wing. So in that sense, it's a lot like the Weather Underground and the RCP and Bob Avakian, or except it's anti-Marxist. It's not like Bob Avakian, it's not communist, it's anarchist, but still far left. But what's I think uniquely possibly 90s about it is that it's not about, it doesn't have the compulsory quality. What I mean is that their solution is to sort of say, screw everyone and everything, let's start over.
Yeah.
But that impulse is very much, there's a kind of optional aspect to that. That's very different from, so it's different from, like, say, vote for this congressperson because they'll defend choice or abortion rights.
Sure.
Because it seems to me that's more like, that presupposes. So I guess the real question is, are you going to be in the system at all to enact change within the system? Or are you going to be indifferent? No systems, let's start a little commune or a little, and that's maybe the latter is maybe more of a 90s thing. I don't know. Yeah. It's hard to know, but I think a lot of it, I mean, my politics are not like any of these politics. I have to say, full disclosure, I'm not a far leftist, and I'm also not a conservative. So I kind of country, man with no country. But what I mean is, that I think it's interesting to observe these movements and these.
Boy, now that we talk about it, I'm thinking, when people say, "Where did Gen X go?" I'm thinking that Occupy Wall Street was the end of it. After Occupy Wall Street basically fizzled out and things went completely the other direction, I think Gen X just gave up. I think that, like you said, the let's check out of the system, that disappeared, because I don't think in general millennials are like that. Millennials,
they're the opposite,
right?
Millennials are all about
involvement,
civic duty, responsibility, change the world, make the world a better place. I hate to put it this simply, but they are basically progressives of one sort or another, and almost in lockstep.
Sure.
And I don't know why they're that way. I mean, I'm not like that, but of course, you know, I was like that when I was very young. So I've had my own journey. But what I mean is, could they be like that because their parents are? I mean, they're to the degree to which, you know, they rebel against their parents. You know, okay, boomer, but maybe they're rebelling against their parents because their parents weren't left-wing enough. Got to be more left-wing.
Yeah, I could see that for sure. You
got to sign on for every new legislation about trans rights, and you have to do this, and you have to do that, and you have to change Greta. You know, you've got to actually be against. You got to be against your own mom, who's a great opera singer. Because why? Because opera might be environmentally harmful or wasteful, and I don't know. It's just all these these things. I didn't mean to get so much into politics, but I guess it comes out.
Well, it is. I think you've kind of nailed the difference. Is the idea of checking out and not being involved with any kind of system is completely gone.
Yeah.
And I think that this all started off talking about children of God and cults, which in our time period, it was a time when, like Schulman himself talks about how there was a turning away, like a dropping out of society after 68, 69, where those people essentially realized or decided that politics would get them nowhere. They just were going to leave society and start their own thing.
Sure.
And that it's almost like Gen X got that aspect of baby boomer culture, and the millennials got the earlier, more romantic aspect of 67 to 68, and Gen X got 69 to 74 with all the bombings and stuff.
Yeah, we got the Days of Rage and and Patty Hearst and Bernadine Dorn and the Red Army faction and Biden Meinhof. We got all that, that insanity, and maybe maybe we didn't like that or didn't want to. But it's funny. Bruce Schulman told me a personal story of him when he was a teen trying to canvass for a Democratic politician, going from door to door. And this would have been in the late 70s, I think. And he remembers, and this is in a largely Democratic part of New York, I think, where he grew up. And he remembers a change in his neighbors. He remembers that when he was like really young, like early 70s or maybe, I guess, right? Everybody kind of was just basically matter of fact about politics. You vote for the Democrat and you vote for Hubert Humphrey or whoever, and you kind of get on with your life. You don't make a federal case out of it. But he says he noticed when he was trying to canvass for this, he wanted this person to win, that his neighbors were like, politics is bullshit. He's just a crook, or I don't really care about that. So a different, and that was more in 78. So there was a change in that, right? That kind of, and maybe that kind of anti-politics, anti-government is one of the dark things that we're dealing with the effects of now. I don't know. So that,
well,
the idea, if you carry that to its logical conclusion, you should make sure that nobody with any political experience, that only those people are allowed to, it's like kind of like,
I'm not going to speak for Alex, but I'm of the opinion, just after doing this for 4 years, that I at some point I tried to talk Alex into starting a second podcast called Null Exit, which was about how the 90s were the last decade.
That's right.
Not just the last good decade, but
they were just the last decade.
Just the last one that had its own character before everything became recycled and like a simulation of something that had already happened. And so I mean, I can understand what you said when you said you don't like you're not really anything in terms of politics. I'm similar in a way, but
hold that thought. I mean, no. So I do have my own politics, but what I mean to say is that it's not the most important thing in life to me. It's a minor.
Okay.
There's a lot of other things that are important to me. I mean, it's just I'm not. So I guess it's another way to say I'm not an extremist. Or I'm not.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
Sure.
I just mean to,
But I mean, everything seems like something that already happened. It seems like a product. People are reliving things that already happened.
Right.
And so in some ways it's hard to get attached, I think, for people. In others, obviously it's not hard, but it's a weird grinding down of like novelty to where things are new, but they're not actually new. They're rebooted.
Sure. Yeah. Well, they're copies of copies, right? Is that kind of what you're saying? You're saying that creates a different aesthetic, right? If you're doing a copy of something, and you're doing
there's a There's a quote that I've said before on the podcast, so Mitch, you've probably already heard me say this, but it's actually a quote again by Chuck Klosterman from his book in the 90s, where he talks about some of the changing in pop culture. He uses it in pop culture context, but he says content could be created from content.
Oh yeah.
And so that's something I think about a lot when you're kind of looking at like different decades and sort of like what do you have left to work with? Like, for example, through Matt and whatever, I've gotten into like a lot of genres of film just because the 70s is so rich with it and it has its own distinctive stamp, so there's everything from like crime movies, there's horror, stuff like that. And some of those sort of set the tone for things, like exploitation movies or this, subgenre or something like that. And then I'll be, checking out some streaming stuff and just kind of flipping through the little thumbnails. And I'll see these things that are clearly like a 21st century take on something that came out of the 70s, like, some kind of a horror film or a crime film or something like that. And it's just, it seems too self-aware to be good. It's like, you just know that B movie from 2015 is not going to have like the honesty, for lack of a better term, of the B movie from 1975.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, imagine if somebody tried to remake Massacre at Central High now, or remake that, or I don't know. Well, they wouldn't do it. First of all, they probably. I mean, made a movie like that now, it'd probably be banned in pre-production, and they would halt production because someone would be offended by the prospect of it. They would be probably worried about kids copying it and shooting up their fellow classmates.
Well, it's funny on that,
like a remake of Gummo. Yeah.
Speaking of or things that get made that never were made. There was that whole thing. I forget when these actually came out, but you guys both know that there was that time where Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino did that double feature, 2 different movies, Planet Terror and Death Proof. And they released them in cinemas at the same time, and then they like had all these like fake trailers and ads and stuff like that to go with it. The whole package was this grindhouse thing that they were calling the whole entire package. So what's funny is, as time has gone on, I've been on YouTube and I've watched all the fake trailers, and I'm like, how fun, these are cool, they look period, like they've got like the shitty film stock and all that stuff, and they've got like guest directors and everything. But what's weird is since then they have turned all but one of those fake trailers into something. So they've turned like the Thanksgiving horror movie into a real movie, and like Hobo with a Shotgun and Machete, I think that was one of them. And there's something else too. But the one they haven't done is the one that's like the Nazi werewolf whatevers of the SS. Like you can't do that kind of Nazi exploitation movie with Fu Manchu in it today. That's the one that's going to have to stay the fake trailer with no movie.
Well, I'm surprised. That doesn't surprise me, but I have a first edition in front of me of the book Serial by Cyril McFadden, A You in the Life of Marin County, illustrated from 1977.
Wow.
And I'm going to read you the blurb on the back.
All right.
And ask you, gentlemen, how many of these things you have come in contact with in your 70s research.
Okay.
And this book costs, by the way, it's $4.95, so it's prices. These illustrations are amazing. There's no illustration of anybody doing coke, although there should be. But there's by the way, I have some pro cocaine books in my possession, like first edition of The Joys of Cocaine, and
those are great. That's a great genre.
You've seen those,
yeah.
Any of that here I'm going to read and see if you'll recognize anything that comes to mind. Here in 52 zany episodes is a hilarious and deadly account of the liberated life a la Marin County, California, featuring that average couple, Kate and Harvey Holroyd, who belong to the Sierra Club, attend Mozart festivals, ride Moto Bacani 10 speeds, cherish their Cuisinart until the sushi hits the fan, and they plunge into a world of creative divorce, macrame, lentil leaves, personal growth, enzymes, cool whip fantasies, natural fibers, and crucial, staying mellow at all costs. Meet the Holroyds and all the rest of the gang. Martha, who can't get behind ironing boards. Her 5th husband, Bill. They worked out a contract, including garbage drills, before they even had a permanent commitment. and Bill's ex Vivian and Carol, Katie's flaky friend from her consciousness raising group, who dresses like a Pointer Sister until she finally comes out as gay, and Rita, who's into funk. She had like mutated over the years through Gurdjieff, Silva mind control, actualism, mind science, human life styling, origami, and Marlene, who's into the body's need for zinc, and Harvey's secretary, Ms. Murphy, who isn't into making coffee for the head honcho, and Phil, just an ordinary sadomasochistic freak, and Paco, the dog hairdresser with the Guatemala accent, and of course, the Polaroid's Manx Cat Vonnegut Jr. It's a cat, I guess, okay. Meet them and then follow them as they, and this is all capitalized, the following words.
Okay.
Break out, explore their options, get clear, get space. As the real Marin of gourmet goodies and wine tripping fades, and Kate decides to take a lover, the question was whose? And Harvey comes onto the chick at the checkout counter, and Ms. Murphy reveals a sudden consuming interest in Harvey, and Carol gets messed up in a few bad bummer situations. And Kate enters a commune after answering an ad for a mature, mellow female vegetarian and punches out at the gnats in the yogurt. And Harvey moves back after a stint in a one-bedroom condo, and Kate and Harvey settle down to work through their conflicts and stop laying bad trips on each other. Here they are, splitting up, marrying on mountaintops, committing themselves in LTR, living together relationships, renewing and revising their contracts, restructuring, evolving in the universe in a riotous, absolutely wonderful saga of the California dynamic at its most dynamic.
Yeah.
You got it. Any of those things ring a bell that you've encountered? Those kinds of.
I mean, that basically illustrates the slow transition from hippies to yuppies.
Yep, exactly.
The new age movement.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny how many of those things are back. Also,
yeah, well, it's funny that the Cuisinart made it in there, along with everything else.
I never had a Cuisinart. My parents never had one. I don't really know. Did you folks experience that?
I remember my dad having one, and I remember there was something about it that just sounded so like highfalutin. Like it was like the name, the brand, like to this day, like you can just go and buy them, whatever. Like, oh, you can get like the little one that doesn't cost very much at Target or whatever. But I remember to this day, it still sounds like the Rolls Royce of kitchen appliances just because of the name. Because I just got used to that being like, it felt like a weird, like kind of 80s status symbol thing that came out of,
it was a little bit like Le Car. Remember that? Le Car.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the little what was that, a little Peugeot or Renault or something like that?
How long did that last? I don't know. It's kind of well, it's funny. Did you folks experience fondue? Did your parents have fondue?
Not as a child. No.
I have some vague memories of it. It definitely was a thing. Like I remember when fondue restaurants kind of got rebooted, however long ago, and there was a lot of talk about like that it was like a thing from the 70s, or like you'd go to garage sales and somebody's fondue set would be there that they were getting rid of,
Yeah.
Fondue is great though. I mean, people should get back into that.
I don't know. I'm kind of afraid of it.
What is it?
I'm afraid of, hygiene. I just don't like to eat out of, I don't know. I don't like to eat out of, I don't know. I don't want to, do you know what I mean? I just,
yeah.
I like the dessert one. Just get like the one that you dunk in chocolate. You don't have to worry about like the all meat strips or anything like that.
Oh yeah.
Or just like cheese or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that definitely illustrates the whole emphasis on self-exploration and self-actualization.
Oh, totally.
What is it? A human potential.
Human potential. Right.
Well, one of the very first paragraphs of one of the chapters, because the book is written in the language of these people. So it's written from an omniscient narrator, right? Who's sort of not believing in it. So Sarah McFadden, it's sort of satire, but she uses the language. and kind of so for example, and it kind of it makes the novel strange because if you're not really into that language, you don't really know what the hell they're talking about. So I guess here's an example. One chapter is called Reordering the Priorities. Don't know what that means. And then the first paragraph is, their first priority, Kate and Harvey agreed, was to work through their conflicts, stop laying bad trips on each other, and restructure their marriage. It was a heavy number for sure, but they could do it. For one thing, they really wanted to get it together. And for another,
those catchphrases in there.
It totally sounds like they got called to HR.
I don't know. Yeah.
And when you hear like head trip,
together. Does that mean not be apart? I guess we're getting the shit together. And
it's so businesslike. That's one thing about New Age and the yuppies is the business attitude and way of doing things invades everything. Even relationships. You get this weird managerial textbook way of talking about relationships, and it's contractual.
Yeah, well, you had I think the mainstreaming of like therapeutic stuff a lot more.
Oh yeah,
and it's like DIY therapy sort of thing. So that was just, I became part of the lexicon. Yeah, well, it's interesting too when you talk about people like pulling away. I'm just kind of doing a little bit of a callback to some things we were talking about before. It's funny how that's part of, I think that idea of like withdrawing in order to improve yourself, like that was the driving force behind a lot of these things that were these intentional communities.
Absolutely.
Some of the ones we picked on, we talked about like the farm in Tennessee, who were big with soybeans, and just some of these other ones where it's a little more interesting, I think, to explore them, because some of them you do have like the villains out there, like the really terrible cults, or
like the children of God,
the Manson family or whatever. But it's interesting to see these ones where you can sort of just see them and sort of just like go through like their struggle and their transition and sort of what made them appealing or what drew people to them. Some of it is so predatory that it's really hard to figure it out. But like you'd mentioned earlier, Mitch, talk about someone was like talking about Osho to you.
Yeah, well, my woman I was dating was really an Osho disciple.
Exactly. And I remember like reading accounts of people who joined the Rajneeshis, and they were just talking about how like some of these teachings really hit them hard and they really spoke to them and that sort of thing. And it's easy to forget that some of this stuff, I mean, again, some of these were more benevolent than others, but they really did speak to people. And it's interesting to see like just how someone kind of went through like an internal journey when they found this and decided to like give up some part of their old life and step into
what that reminds me. One of your very first episodes is an episode that I learned, and I did not know anything really about it. So I knew who Steve Allen was because
the Love family.
Well, because I'm a
his son.
Pianist, and he wrote jazz songs, wrote
right.
amount of songs, and was one of the Tonight Show hosts in the 50s. And but I did not know about his story with his son at all. I didn't know about any of that. And so it was really something to hear that episode. You guys uncover his book and Steve Allen and that whole thing. And
that was another one of those mixed bag cults, if you will. Like there were some questionable and things about it that aren't good, but it wasn't like completely unredeemable, and that's, again, that's, and some of those you don't hear about because you do hear about the worst things. You do hear about Jonestown, and stuff like that, but you don't hear about these ones where there wasn't like, a whole bunch of murders that went along with it or something horrible.
What do you folks, I'm just saying I learned a lot from that episode, and you guys did too, evidently. It's odd that you feel for Steve Allen in a way, but you could sort of understand maybe his son was just like a lot of us, just wanted to find his own faith, his own spirituality.
Sure.
Just took this form of this particular sect or this particular group, I guess.
And that's probably hard too when you have a famous parent, because I think a lot of people feel like they're living in their parents' shadow and that sort of thing. It opens doors for them, but then, you close the only door you've got.
Well, it might close the door of something totally different, right? So maybe the son was trying to find his own thing or his own stuff, as they would have said then. But
it's also really hard to put yourself in a historical person's shoes.
True.
Because sometimes we're probably all doing things that people in the future might think are odd or like poorly thought out, but we're just doing them because it's a thing people are doing.
Yeah,
And
or it's the best
it's not
option
even. Yeah, but so when we look at the stuff 50 years later, we tend to like over intellectualize and think, why did they do that?
Exactly.
Maybe they were doing it just because it was fun, or it was better than the other options they had at the moment.
And it hadn't been done. There was nothing to reflect on. It was something new. I mean, it could only be taken at face value because it hadn't been around long enough or well known enough to have like a body of reflections that you could, hear about secondhand and say, well, okay, you could only experience it one way or one direction.
Yeah. Well, I guess the phrase I always comes to my mind is the "what were they thinking?" It's the distance traveled. It's like, well, these are these alien people that did these strange rituals and ceremonies long ago in 1976, and so I guess a lot of it is the distance traveled. So somebody really young who wasn't around then, but somebody who did do it, but it's almost like a different person. So they say, what were they thinking when they, when they had that hairdo or wore that jacket, or when they,
sure,
yeah,
or when they had pursued polyamory in a way that was irresponsible, or was kind of not, there's ways to do it, but they did it in the wrong way, or in a way that makes you go, God, what was I thinking? Or that. Right. That's kind of I'm wondering how much of that impulse is just a natural effect of being modern people. By which I mean, in the modern world, people make choices. And in the traditional world, and I'm using that very broadly, so modern could be like, it's not just 20th century. It starts, I think, in 18th century, a little bit. But then you think about traditional society, like really with a capital T, like older communities. And so in traditional societies, it's not about your choice or,
sure.
It's about basically you kind of do what your folks did and what they
right.
folks did. And it's kind of laid out for you. So I'm wondering if, being choice-oriented society lends itself to these kinds of embarrassments or change of heart, or, you know what I mean?
Sure.
Sure.
You might make
some of that is,
yeah.
I agree with you, Mitch. And just my comment on that is some of that is very much generational. It's you can't tell the story of like baby boomers during the long 70s without talking about how these things that were both new and available shaped that. You had people who were going to college for the first time.
Absolutely.
You had that post-war prosperity. You had just a lot of like cultural changes that were coming about. So all these things were happening at the same time. So it was just like this perfect sort of petri dish for people doing something different from their folks because they could study something different. They could work in something different. They were aware of something. It could be everything from a new field to work in to a new religious movement or a commune to join. I mean, it was just like, there was a perfect storm, I think, of things that enabled people to make choices and to break the mold, at least as far as like, their parents and grandparents options.
Absolutely. So that's definitely a choice, as you said, choosing, breaking the mold, going to school for the first time. I know that's something Bruce Shulman really emphasized to me in my episode, is that he said this was the first era. Well, it's the first era that women entered the workforce en masse.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah.
And it was the first era where education became this kind of universal thing, like going to, secondary education, like college.
Yeah.
And he also told a story about another personal story of his life of seeing the change on college campuses of activism.
Right.
So in 1966, like everybody was against the Vietnam War, right?
Right.
But the way they were against the war, as he pointed out to me, is we're just against the war. There was no mention of the identity of the protester. Not even the identity of like, we're college kids against the war. Not even. It was always, this war is wrong, get out of Vietnam. That was what all the signs were.
Yeah.
In the long 70s, like, the degree to which it's at the end of the tail end, right? Because they were. So in 72, you see a change on college campuses. You see Chicanos against the war, women against the war. You see these separate booths. Asian Americans, sort of Vietnamese Americans against the war. You start to see things defined in terms of the separate little subcultures, and that becomes really important. And of course, I guess Bushman was saying that was a story of the 70s where people got into their own tribes or into their own.
Sure.
And interesting.
Well, the war was anti-war activism or whatever was just such an aggregator and the glue between people. I remember reading a memoir of a midwife, and she was basically saying after the war ended, like she and her friends or whoever, her community, were kind of at loose ends because opposing the war was like the engine that drove them and held them together and everything. And they needed to sort of find this like post-Vietnam War identity. And she got into like being a midwife or gathering herbs or something like that. So, you know, I think that speaks to part of it too.
Well, that I met many people like her when I was in my parents' business, obviously, because they would use, midwives would use our products, of course, because it was natural. And a lot of the people that were definitely women identified as midwives were into natural cosmetics and natural, not just natural foods, but natural soap and and all that. I mean, it reminds me of some of that. Are you folks interested a lot in doing an episode on Werner Erhard and Est and Landmark, or have you thought about?
Yeah, we've definitely thought about it. I think that would be a big one to tackle because that is really the tip of an iceberg that still kind of persists.
Sure.
I mean, and there were that's only a small part of that whole movement. And I think sometimes the weird thing is we've been doing this for 4 years.
Yeah.
We've really only scratched the surface.
Oh yeah, that's true.
And we try to make these roadmaps of what we're going to cover ahead of time, but a lot of times we end up it's very like free form. We'll choose a topic for the next couple episodes based on what we're interested at the moment.
Yeah.
Or, what an episode we just did will give us an idea for the next episode. But I know that Est we've been talking about that maybe just off air for a long time.
Well, I should say full disclosure that I'm actually a fan. So I'm actually like Werner Erhard's thought in his I've actually listened to his. I think I've listened to every lecture that's been released, either bootleg. There's many bootlegs, but on YouTube there's an enormous amount of them. If you want to listen to him talk and listen to his things, I find him very interesting. Now, I'm not saying he's perfect. I'm not saying he's without flaws, and of course his movement is complicated, of course. But he is an interesting person, brilliant. He was not a charlatan, without a doubt. Brilliant mind.
Well, I don't mean to interrupt, but I thought that the main controversy over Est was what happened actually at like the events, and not particularly what the ideas were. Am I wrong about that?
That's one of the controversies. Yeah, I mean a lot of that. Yeah, I mean you're talking about the treatment of people.
Yeah,
a number of things, like the documentary. Of course, the Holocaust survivor, or her. Was her mother a Holocaust survivor? I know there was some discussion of trauma, and Werner Erhard is kind of tough with her and saying basically, when are you going to stop being a victim and start identifying yourself as a person and not as a woman or not as a Jewish woman, in kind of a tough way. And some people were offended by that, and maybe, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I respect objections to that, but again, it's decontextualized because she had just been in a 5-hour session with Erhard.
Yeah,
they had many things were discussed. So it was in a context of them trying to solve problems in their life, and but there are things like that, bathroom breaks and all that, and there must be things, but it is a vast. Alex, do you have any interest? I mean, you in the interest in the lore of Est at all, or is that kind of
Alex?
Yeah. I'm sorry, guys. I sometimes I get a little bit of a dropout there in it, but I definitely am familiar with the movement, just very slightly. We definitely have to bone up on that. Sorry if I if I missed the specific question there, like I said, there was a dropout for a second.
Oh no, I was asking you what you did know about it, or what from your familiarity with like John Denver and Valerie Harper were big boosters of it. Raul Julia, and
yeah, I mean, honestly, it's just a name I know, sort of like in the context of the time.
Yeah,
there, I think it would be. I think that could definitely be part of. I think Matt alluded to this earlier, but part of like something we could do, I guess, approach or find a way to sort of manage it topic wise into kind of like the right sized pieces, or come back. That's one thing we try and do. I know that sometimes we'll have multi-part things, or we'll have a topic that that we have to sort of set aside until we can like sort of get our arms around it the best way. But that's definitely, just the therapeutics that came out in there. There's a number of them, actually. We've never really had a whole episode on it. But for example, we've talked about a writer, and bear with me if I'm kind of taking a tangent here, but we talk a lot about a writer named Robert Anton Wilson, and he talks about various therapeutic things. He's big on like Wilhelm Reich, for example. I know that's not exactly what we're talking about here, but just it's like you really can't get into some of the big names of this time period without hearing these various therapeutic techniques pop up.
And then there's Eureka. They're again downsized, or is it the Eureka people, or the Synanon, because I know the
addiction recovery.
Well, it's funny because Synanon really did help Art Pepper, the great jazz alto sax player, saxophone, and he went through that. And he came out
Philip K.
clean.
Dick must have had something to do with them at some point, because I think he alludes to them under a different name in one of his books. Can't put my finger on it. I'm not sure if it's a Scanner Darkly or something like that, but I think he had some experience with them.
Alex, I wanted to ask you and Matt a question about how do you deal with revised information, by which I mean, I don't mean like revisionist ideological information. I just meant new facts come out, and I'm sure you folks are familiar with the new interpretation of Manson because of Tom O'Neill's book, right?
Yeah.
What do you folks think about that? How we understand Manson? Because I've been sort of grappling with it, because I read his book and really like it, but it's how much does really change, or does it not change, or does it? What do you think? I don't really know. It doesn't make Charles Manson into a good innocent victim. It doesn't do that.
Sure.
But it does complicate the picture if the CIA was doing experiments, or if I don't know.
Well, I'm a big fan of revision because in general, I think that most of what people know about the time period is this kind of romanticized mythology that is always kind of simplistic and lurid and kind of muddles into true crime reporting. And so I generally just assume that there's a lot more going on that we don't know about.
Right.
So I'm always open to new information, and it would make total sense to me if Charles Manson was involved with the CIA, or even if, I mean, honestly, I haven't read Chaos. I think that Alex did, but I'm familiar with kind of the ideas. And
that's Tom O'Neill's book. I think that's new.
Yeah.
Are we talking like the Sidney Gottlieb side of?
No, we're talking about.
No, we're talking about specifically Tom O'Neill's reporting. His book Chaos, which it actually came out the same year as Once Upon a Time in Hollywood did, which is interesting. Interesting, they both came out the same year. I remember.
Yeah, I remember that book was kind of inconclusive, and I think the thing that you have to grapple with all this, with a lot of revisions, especially the ones involving any kind of intelligence, is that most likely you'll never know, because the nature of the stuff is secret, and despite the fact that they're supposed to declassify things, and the church,
and even then it's dribs and drabs sometimes.
So I think there were some intimations and some interesting information, but it was inconclusive in the end. But I generally just take the stance of it's definitely possible. That's because there are stories we know actually happened that are so similar to that I can totally picture it happening.
Sure. Well, what's similar,
what
of course,
was
well, it reminds me of an episode you did on that was another Netflix documentary on the gentleman, the nuclear researcher who jumped out the window, right? What
Oh,
was that?
right. Yeah, that's
Aaron
the whole thing
Morris?
with Sidney Gottlieb. Yeah, and,
Yeah,
and MK Ultra and that kind of stuff.
yeah, I think that was Aaron Morris film, right? Wormwood or Worm? Is that I'm thinking the same?
Yeah, I think
Yeah, I
that was
remember
the TV
they
show. Yeah.
recently did something. Yeah, one of those Netflix
But
shows.
it does connect to a story like that.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, Jolly West is a guy who pops up in way too many convenient places to most of it be
Right.
accidental. The fact that he had an office at the San Francisco Free Clinic,
Oh yeah,
and I think that was in chaos, but
it's very much in chaos. A lot of the book is about Jolly West's life,
but that's I don't know. You're on Twitter. Do you follow any of the parapolitical people on Twitter?
Who, me?
Yeah.
No, I don't. I'm very strict. I mean, not strict is not the word. My Twitter stuff is all about the arts. So movies and novelists and what, I certainly don't get involved in any what's the word? Movements or, if I can help it. Right. So I tend not to get in. I'm not saying that one shouldn't. I'm saying that's just not really my beat. So I'm not as far as I know. In other words, I don't know.
Yeah,
I am interested in journalism, but I'm also, as you know, as I said earlier, I'm a fairly mainstream.
Yeah.
I mean, I identify as a moderate and not I'm not far left or I'm not, I'm kind of try to be moderate in all things and
yeah,
maybe to a fault, I guess, but I don't know. But I did think that Tom O'Neill's book was convincing. I'm not saying that it wasn't, but.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I was just going to say that there are people on Twitter who spend their entire life tracking down every place Jolly West was connected.
Oh my goodness.
So, it's just a situation where we pay this organization, the CIA millions of dollars a year to do secret stuff, and then people just assume they're not doing anything. It's really kind of weird.
Of course. I mean, I certainly agree with that. I mean, Alex, what are your thoughts about that? I mean, that's a different about just the whole issue of these new facts or sort of the,
about like about how things, that the idea of, well, my thought is I'll answer that kind of just in a way of sort of how I view like how you have to tell or how you can tell a story about something. So everything starts at one time, it's current events, and then at some point it passes into history. But then there's different layers of history, and I think how we see history is reflected in like the moment in which we study it. Like how we view something in history today is different as how we looked at that topic as a historical topic even 10 years ago, for example. And then depending on how old the topic is, the further you go back, you get closer to current events and less about history. So I feel like I don't know if this is answering your question exactly, but I sort of feel like it becomes there's always something changing. So I feel like for us, as far as our topics go, I don't know. We've never talked about revisiting a topic on the podcast, but as far as just like my own personal thoughts, and I'm not going to speak for Matt on this, but just like, I just feel like even studying history is a snapshot of the time in which you study it.
Absolutely.
Because you're dealing with like how people are defining history in that moment. Even though people think of history as unchanging, it's
well, when they say that, so when people say they think of history as unchanging, what they mean, and they're right about this, is that the past is fixed because it already
of course.
But of course, what you're going, I'm sorry, but you're going to go and say that there's some things that change radically. You know how you go ahead. You were going to say something interesting about that.
Oh no, no, I was just saying of course the actual events are the same, but
Yeah.
I guess I've been around it. I've noticed just people talking about historical topics in a different sense now because, you want to try and be, there's just different ways to study history. And I've just noticed in my time of being interested in history, primarily as a layperson, it's interesting how the perspective of history changes. And I feel like it's always reflective of the time in which you study it. But it's good to have it. Like I remember thinking to myself when there was all this terrible stuff that happened after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, I was thinking to myself, I can't wait for this to be in the past so I can look back on it historically with more of a dispassionate look.
I mean, I should again be more candid. I don't like the way things are discussed today. See, I don't like the way history is done today at all. At least in the broad, in terms of
I'm not even speaking so much about my opinion for what it's worth. I'm just looking at it as like this is sort of what it has become. Like I think,
right, but what that is something I often object to, and so the two things I don't agree. So, there's some background propositions behind again, I'm talking about things that are fashionable, not necessarily what's the best. I'm talking about the pop historians, or the ones that make the bestseller list. What's very contemporary that I object is that, well, number one, they're always ideological, by which I mean they think there's a good guy and a bad guy.
Oh, sure.
Everything, but even more than that, it's not only my objection isn't only that they think there's a good guy and bad guy, because there are often villains in history. I concede that. But it's the way that that's the only thing they talk about. And the way they think that fact is the sole causal factor, when I actually don't think the world works that way at all. So, for example, how I see Manson. So Tom O'Neill book is interesting. So I actually, as I said earlier, I think it's possible that Manson can both be not an innocent victim, by which I mean he bears responsibility for how he treated those girls and what he did there and all that. And I even think he bears responsibility in a way for those murders.
Sure.
I think all of that can be true. And yet at one and the same time, Manson's mind was, fucked with or screwed with by these strange psychology experiments. I think that's all that can be. So I don't think it's either or. I think it's kind of both and, if that, you know what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I mean, I see it, but I don't know. I think the trend now is to find out what the truth is. So the thing now is to say, well, who's the real bad guy? And it's got to be just the CIA. And in that, of course, we got to so then we have to rehabilitate Manson, and we have to be like the people that love Manson, because that's the thing now, like his poetic sayings, and look at him positively, which I don't have any sympathy with, but
sure.
But
history is kind of an aesthetic art, though.
Oh, absolutely.
So to kind of piggyback on what Alex said, is the way you look at history is through the current lens. And I feel like that's conditioned by aesthetics.
Oh, absolutely.
And so in history is such a ambiguous thing that two people can look at the same basic events and see two different things. And I feel like it's kind of an aesthetic choice. Like if you see the past as a moral landscape to be judged, and it's dark and evil, and that's how you're gonna judge everyone. You're gonna see everything that way,
right?
Whereas I just think Alex and I see the complexity as aesthetically pleasing. I guess it's kind of hard to describe.
Yeah, no. Well, I mean, as far as the podcast goes, if I can jump in here, and again, I'm not speaking for Matt, but I'm just piggybacking on what that says. What Matt just said, it's like within our podcast, we're not really out to come to those conclusions for people. It's more, it's not to give sanction to anything, and it's not to condemn anything other than where it's patently obvious. But I guess it's more like we try to take a value neutral, if that's the right word, or a more politics neutral take on it. It's more just, I mean, we cover so many things, so it's like if our podcast was all about politics, then I guess maybe it would be different. But we just cover so many things. I mean, really, at the end of the day, our only parameters are like the time period.
Oh yeah.
You know, we try to jump on all. In fact, I think we really do try to mix it up. We'll say, hey, let's not do 2 of this kind of episode in a row. Let's make sure we're looking at something else, or if we hear something, let's put that in.
You want to have variety, but in the case where I learned things, like I learned about Steve Allen, I also learned a lot because I didn't really have to say I didn't know a lot about the occult.
Sure.
You folks have done so many episodes on not just Robert Anton Wilson, but all these, I guess they're movements. I don't know what you would call them, and works of literature. And those things, I have to say, did freak me out. I mean, I don't know if freak out is the word, but I was like, wow, this is.
Are you talking about like our horror episode or episodes?
Well, not just that, but Illuminati and just.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And it's kind of fascinating. And often when I heard those, I'm trying to fit this into my theory of self-expression. And maybe it does fit into that. Maybe it's just the different forms that expression's taking, that it takes this.
Yeah. Well, what probably one reason why we approach the long 70s the way we do, and I'm not sure if Alex thinks about it this way, but I'm interested in maybe I've never been an ancient history person. I'm maybe the last couple 100 years are the most interesting to me.
Right.
And so I have this definite understanding that this is not the first time that people got really weird.
No.
There's the late 19th century, things got very strange.
Oh yeah.
And people joined odd groups who did strange things. And so I don't even really see the long 70s as an unusual period. I think it's unusual because of like specifically in its formative power over today.
But you know what, Matt, it's our weird.
Yeah, it is
our unusual. Yeah. We had to deal with it more directly, so that's
sure. That's a good point.
It's well documented in different ways, which is a luxury you don't have when you study ancient history.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
So the things that people consider a cult in the long 70s were normally bigger movements earlier in history.
Sure.
The Robert Anton Wilson stuff, he's drawing from things that happened in the 20s and 30s and the late 19th century. Even all the Reichian therapy stuff, that's second generation Freudian. And so I mean, history, it's always hard to it's hard not to say something started in the long 70s, but usually things don't just start. Things become revisited, transformed, renewed, and that's a lot of the things that people consider spooky or occult about the long 70s really come from the early 20th century, which was a much weirder time than the long 70s in all kinds of ways.
Plus things get rediscovered. I mean, the term reboot is a 20th century term, but the concept isn't new. Just to use an example, there's a series of books. They're trade paperback books that were published, I think, largely in the 70s by a publisher called Dover. So I just call them Dover books in shorthand. But they're all reprints of older books. But they were something that was interesting enough to a publisher in the 70s that they got reprinted. So like a lot of them are like on maybe herbal medicine or something like that. So, I mean, some of this stuff goes back millennia, but, to somebody who's trying to market books in the 1970s, and they know that part of their crowd is interested in the back to the earth movement or back to the land movement or something like that. Yeah. They're going to drag out this folk medicine book from such and such.
That reminds me of my dad's stuff he was into, and his mother, my grandmother used to make her own. So, and that kind of stuff. So, Ewell Gibbons and Stalking,
Ewell Gibbons,
Stalking Asparagus. But that stuff became mainstream in a way. Maybe now.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the
huge
the reboot is nothing new. The term reboot is new, but the concept is not new.
Yeah.
Is there a movie that's like the most 70s? Is there a single movie? I wonder. Like, it's not Saturday Night Fever, maybe. I don't know. Is there I don't know. Or in your different episodes you've covered, you like this movie. If you had an alien coming down and didn't know anything about time periods, and the alien wanted to speak our language and say, well, what was the 70s? What would you show them?
I would love to be able to think of one and have one at hand, but I think part of the beauty and like my own affinity for that time period is I can't say that because there are directions to go in. You know, there's like frothy comedies, there's dark sci-fi, there's crime films, you know, and on and on. So I think the flowering of genres in film alone, it makes that question that you just put to us hard to answer, but I think it's also what makes it so fascinating to me.
Well, it's a fun question in a way, right?
I mean, like Taxi Driver, Shaft, towards the later period, Escape from New York is definitely one of those. You know, honestly, it tends to be the movies that have withstood the test of time. The ones that people still watch are the ones that, in some ways, encapsulate the time period the best. Like the later ones, I think Ghostbusters encapsulates the end of the long 70s.
That's interesting. What makes that film? Well, I mean, I know you folks talked about the entrepreneurial. You use a really interesting episode you guys did where you said it exemplified an entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah. I think
kind of solving people's problems, and we'll come to your basement, and that whole thing is very 80s, right? That's a new, right? It's kind of
yeah. It's this. It's also almost the way like class is brought back into like the discussion. That these guys are they kind of go from being academics to like blue collar schlubs. You know,
that's a good point.
I can't remember who said it. It was some YouTube channel. It said that Ghostbusters is basically a story about a bunch of guys who get fired from their college jobs and become exterminators.
Yeah.
You know, and
a little bit like Harold Ramis and Stripes singing that teaching at school. He say, "Do Ron, baby, Ron." He does that song, right? He sings, does a sing along in his class with this big afro, and funny. It makes me think about that because he's like a speaker.
The weird thing about the 70s is that it's almost defined by the fact that you can't pick one movie.
Yep.
Right.
It's like the 60s, you could maybe encapsulate in a 2 or 3 movies, but the 70s, there's so many subcultures.
Right, exactly. It's that window is so much smaller in the 60s. And I think it starts off when we have an episode where we talk about like the end of the Hays Code, basically. And
I love
director
that. Well, that was
cinema.
that was like Hollywood history. That was wonderful. I remember.
So with that in mind, I mean, that's exactly why it's so hard, because it's like you have these much smaller windows in past decades of what I'm going to go ahead and call good cinema or good film or whatever. Sure. But in the 70s, you just get all the stuff. I mean, sure, there's shit too in there, but that's also part of the fun. I mean, I don't know. It's just, I guess I'm just showing like my own like personal, you know, interest in it or whatever. But it's just, it's the depth and the breadth. It's crazy for a decade, you know? And it is.
Alex and Matt, I want you guys to think about the fact that I was 8 years old and I saw Let Me Die a Woman in a theater. As an 8-year-old boy, that's with a 42nd Street audience. That's not. You could call my parents' parenting into question with that. I don't know. You know the movie I'm talking about. We get a Doris. Let Me Die.
Speaking of like 42nd Street theaters at various times, the 70s were also the time where you had like the first kind of mainstreaming of porn. You know, the idea of like people who get dressed up and go out on a date to Behind the Green Door or The Devil and Miss Jones or Deep Throat or something like that.
The Private Afternoons of Pamela Mann or the different Radley Metzger, Harry Paris pictures, Opening of Misty Beethoven, and those were the movies. Those were the films.
Yeah. Well,
so you had a lot of a lot of crazy. I think also too, people think that certain genres started in the 21st century. I know Matt and I have kind of made a joke before, like grousing about younger folks sometimes and being like, oh, they think like something was just invented or they heard about something for the first time recently. But it's like there's all kinds of like weird genres that got their start
in the
during the 70s, like, you know, when like the Saw movies and Hostel and stuff like
those
that came out,
stuff in the
like,
long 70s. That's all.
you know, it's like, yeah, you say, well, that's a 21st century movie about, you know, whatever. It gets the torture porn name, but it's like, but then there were all those cannibal movies, you know, or
I mean,
found footage.
If you guys agree with me on that, I think of Last House on the Left and
right, exactly. There's that.
That's
That's a better example. But even the concept of a found footage movie, it didn't start with even the Blair Witch Project.
Yeah. Yeah, Cannibal Holocaust.
Exactly.
And what else?
Not that that's a good movie, but I'm just saying, you know, again, there was the creativity is just like astounding sometimes when you put it in its context and you look at what came before and what came after.
Well, that gets to it earlier. I think, Alex, it was your point that there's like things are remaking or remade.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of things have a kind of a copycat quality.
Yeah.
Yeah,
sure.
And maybe the Saw films are like that. Maybe they're copying a B movie or you know, copying them.
Well, you could really push boundaries like further and in more ways. Like there was just more boundary pushing per year, I would say, in the long 70s, like prior to that, unless you really dig up like some obscure like pre-code stuff. But just, you know, it was just incredible. I mean, just when you look at just a year that a given film came out, I mean, it just created a vast amount of stuff that people would inevitably remake or knock off or whatever. I don't know.
What does Three's Company fit in? Is Three's Company going to be? How will people see that in the future? I don't know. I kind of, because it's Suzanne Summers and now John Ritter and
Jeez.
That's actually really interesting too from a building a TV show standpoint. It's funny. There's about a 10-year gap between like the Munsters and Three's Company. Right. And what's interesting is I remember seeing some of the episodes of like the Addams Family or the Munsters or something, and there's only one plot, and it's just the weirdest thing. There's no subplots in that 60s TV. And then by the time you get to 1977 or whatever with Three's Company, like there's a subplot. Like you're following Jack for part of it, but then you're following Janet for part of it, and they're totally different plots that they've worked into it. So even just like the way, and I guess maybe you give who is it, Norman Lear, you know, credit for that because he's the guy behind so many of these things. But you know, just even in that like that 10-year window, like just how much even just a crappy broadcast TV show changed.
Right. Well, I mean, I do think that art forms can die and be reborn and live. I don't think that I often think historically about art, right, and aesthetics. I often think that there are art forms that are eternal, for lack of a better word, even though that may sound pretentious, but not many are eternal. And many die a death, you know, like we might be seeing now today the death of the sex comedy because of political changes that people, it's not so much that people would be offended and not laugh. They actually might not even get the joke.
Yeah.
Because their whole conception of what sex is or what human bodies are might change so radically, and that the humor depends on more of an old fashioned, right? It depends on you know, coming out of the 50s, 60s, 70s, different era.
Well,
I'm just thinking out loud, but
a lot of the art and creative work that was produced in the long 70s depended on transgressing boundaries, right? And they really pushed it as far as they could.
Yes, they did.
They broke all the boundaries.
Yes,
and then what do you do? I think that's what they've been running into since maybe the mid 2000s, when the crazy wacky sex comedy and like Tropic Thunder and those movies came out. After that, they're just like, what boundaries are left? And there really isn't anything that is easily accessible. So
just like musicals go in and out of fashion. Like, I mean, when La La Land came out, which is a movie I really loved, I thought, wow, we're going to see a return of the MGM musical or the Jacques Demy, but that never took. And not only didn't win the award, I never saw it.
Well, it's really hard to get people interested in wholesome entertainment now. I mean, after like the 70s and 80s and 90s with the Tarantino stuff. It's a lot easier to get people's attention with true crime than Hallmark movies. It's just appeals to a different part of the brain.
Well, its role also, I think how people saw its role, like in the very beginning when we started rolling here, Mitch, you made a joke about a very special episode. And
Yeah.
it's like those don't exist anymore. Like I remember catching like a 90210 episode from the first season, from the early 90s, and there were still like life lessons, being pushed by the characters.
Isn't that funny? Guess what I'm rewatching now is I'm in binge watching 90210, and I'm on season 7 or 8. But yeah, you're right. So what episode would that have been? The one where a lot of it involves Dylan's drug use, right? Dylan's recovery, right? Kind of.
Yeah, they had a few different episodes. I just remember one where like somebody early on in the show had a racist friend, and Jason Priestley's character called him out on it or something like that.
Absolutely. So, well, not only that, but Donna's mom is racist. Donna's mom.
Yeah, right.
Tori Spelling's mom objects to her dancing with a African American football quarterback. At the party, we don't be dancing with him. Really, very. They're very. It's a very
but it's interesting how that stopped. Or maybe if it was in TV shows, just to use that example, you had to do it in a different way. That because that stuff feels a little clumsy now. It seems very much like it got wrote in, and you sort of see the part in the show. We're like, okay, this is the lesson part.
What will never fail? This is the show that will always give me the creeps. And Gordon Jump is an amazing actor, and you know what I'm talking about. Gordon Jump is more known for WKRP, the boss.
Right.
But he's the pedophile in the Different Strokes episode, the Bicycle Man.
Oh yeah.
Go back and watch that Different Strokes. That is a 2-part. That one is like a horror. That's a frightening. That to me frightens me. Just Gordon Jump's performance and Gary Coleman and Todd Bridges. That's an amazing.
Well, that was when kids stopped being free range.
That's right.
And started being
supervised.
Yeah, basically zoo animals. When every parent thought their kids were going to be kidnapped by Satanists or pedophiles or serial killers.
Well, it occurred to me only very recently that the term latchkey or latchkey kid isn't when you say that, it means children of a certain age in a certain point in human history. It's not even like an ongoing thing. Like when you say latchkey kid, you're not talking about kids past a certain year, even. Like you're probably talking about Gen X kids at a certain window of time.
Well, let me ask you an informational question. Is that because they have different means of monitoring now? Is it computers now or phones or what is it now? Or right? I don't know what they do now because I'm not a. What's the change? Is it a technology change, right? Mainly, or
it seems like the kids are a lot busier now.
Well, yeah, they have all these projects and after school, they got it right.
Well, that's also why working a job is not a thing so much. I'm not going to turn into Andy Rooney complaining about kids not having after school jobs here, but it's just an observation. I think Matt and I both had after school jobs in high school.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think that's a thing much anymore with high school kids.
So what are they doing?
Far less so.
Are they doing?
Well, I think they have other stuff to do, like resume building stuff or stuff. I don't know. I mean, I guess if you're late enough in high school, you're trying to get into college. Well, a lot of kids at least, and then you got to do the stuff to build that up. Like doing community service projects. I remember I was working somewhere, and there were kids that were there to do community service, and my first thought is, I thought community service is what you did when you got caught shoplifting, and they're like, no, this is just what they're doing to bulk up their resume for their college application. Like they were, handing out stuff. To the younger kids or working.
Well, all of these things, Alex, all these things you're mentioning are all plot points in Beverly Hills 90210. When Steve Sanders does things wrong, he has to do the community service and has to work at the prison or work at the hospital and clean bedpans, and he tries to find a way to get out of it and cheat that too. And that's kind of because he's the fuck up or he's the.
But by the end of the show, he's a dad driving a minivan. So.
It's a funny show that is so foundational to modern entertainment is Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
What's really, really important for me to finally watch that. I've never seen that. So
I've never seen it either.
Oh, so you and Alex. So what's the only Matt, the only thing I've seen is the movie with Donald Sutherland.
Well, yeah, that's right. Yeah,
That's
that
what
was
I
good.
know. But you're saying it's this whole other phenomenon.
So it's not that I've seen that show so much. I think I've watched a few episodes, maybe a season.
Yeah.
But everybody who's making content, creative work now has seen that.
Okay.
And that's a big part of like the quippiness of movies, the irony, the detached sardonic humor.
So you're saying Buffy became like the playbook for
yeah, it's like that and
shows
Harry
came
Potter
after.
were what a lot of Hollywood people were raised on.
Yeah, sure.
Are you saying
Don't
it's a
know.
template then for like how you see its tentacles or its
Yeah, and so when did Beverly Hills 90210 come out? When did that start?
It came out, I think, in like 1990, right? Thereabouts.
First episode is 91, I think. So that's
91, and then I think it
90
finished in 2000.
There you go. That show defines the 90s. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's like these two divergent like trends, and the one that gained traction in Hollywood and pop culture was Buffy, and not 90210.
Oh yeah, 90210 might have been a show that ran through the 90s, but my impression of it was it owed much more to things before it. You know, it was a soap opera, really, I guess, from the get-go in one form or another. And as the high school aged characters became adults, it became more of a soap opera.
I see.
Yeah. I don't know. I was always more of a Baywatch guy.
No, I didn't watch any of that stuff in real time. I watched 90210 towards
Baywatch,
the end of its run, and then I just went back and saw some of the earlier ones.
Well, if we're talking about, female beauty, but Baywatch, well, both shows, I mean, well, of course, Baywatch is remarkable in that, Pamela Anderson and the different.
Well, that was its selling point, really. I mean, that's
right.
That was.
But what I didn't know about Baywatch is that David Hasselhoff. So David Hasselhoff has a pop career, right? He's a singer. So have you
right.
Have you folks seen Revenge of the Cheerleaders with David Hasselhoff?
No.
That's a must for your show. You got to do so. Revenge of the Cheerleaders, 1977. David Hasselhoff.
Okay.
It's a disco high school musical kind of movie about these cheerleaders. Rainbow Smith is in it. It's got a great cast, and Cheryl Smith, who did a lot of Pam Grier movies, a lot of.
Well, I can't believe we haven't done anything with the Hoff.
Yeah,
actually,
that's true.
He's kind of
what's interesting
under the radar.
I have an anecdote here. Speaking, just since you mentioned disco in high school in the same sentence there.
Yeah, something
what's interesting is there's that late 70s movie that we've probably all three seen, Rock and Roll High School, which features the Ramones.
Oh yeah.
Is that the story goes that's actually came out of the Corman Studios, but
it's supposed to be disco high, right?
Exactly. It was supposed to be disco high school, and at the last minute, there was sort of like, I don't know, let's try maybe the punk rock band here. Let's try Rock and Roll High School. Yeah, exactly. So I think that's just like totally changed whatever like impact Rock and Roll High School has on like whatever it had an impact on ever since. With the
I have to confess, you guys, I'm a disco person more than a rock and roll person. So I
like them both. But having a movie built around the Ramones is cool because there were movies with disco in them.
I actually love the Ramones, but that's a whole separate. The Ramones are kind of unique, but what I'm saying is that one of the things that's made me so happy is the rehabilitation of disco with that Bee Gees documentary and all that.
Yeah.
I'm so happy that's happened. You see people that originally were disco sucks, and now these guys are pretty good. And then
sure.
What do you think about that whole re-examination of Stigwood? And it's nice, huh? That it's kind of people going
disco
back.
was great. I don't really. I feel like the disco rock and roll rivalry was like Betamax and VHS. They were just too competitive. They were competing for market share.
Yeah,
and the whole burning disco records, we're destroying them, blowing them up, was that's like marketing.
Sure.
But like they don't compete for the same experience. Disco is
right.
A dancing.
I think of it as the last pre-electronic dance music.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
because there's still instruments involved, right? There's still trumpets.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you might have like the analog synth, but other than that, you've got like the full band.
You got a Fender Rhodes piano and a bass guitar.
Yeah, and like usually just awesome bass lines, and like it's got its own drum beat and everything. No, I think musically, if you kind of take it out of like the pop culture thing and just look at it from a musical form, it's really cool because it touches on a lot of stuff. It comes out of soul, it comes out of just other things, funk.
You folks did a number of episodes. You did a Funkadelic and more than one, I think.
We did a Funkadelic, Funkadelic episode. Yeah, we've talked about soul soundtracks. When soul singers just got handed the keys to do the soundtrack to movies. Yep. Yeah. So yeah, I mean it's a great. The 70s actually is much more consistent with soul and soul adjacent music than it is for rock music, because it starts off great and then it gets kind of crappy in the middle, and then it kind of morphs into different kinds of rock and roll towards the end with like punk rock and post-punk and things.
That reminds me, I'm at a piano here. Maybe I should play something 70s style music for you folks. What do you think? Should I do it?
Yeah.
I don't know what to do. I improvise, but let's see, make sure the sound, you can hear it. Can you hear it?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do something.
You have a wah pedal on that?
No, this is all acoustic. So you have to. I apologize for the lack of phase shifters and the lack of neutron vipers. Did that sound 70s to you?
Oh, right, yeah.
Yes, definitely. I'm definitely getting some soundtrack vibes out of that.
Yeah. That was great. Not enough people play piano anymore.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. It's kind of fun, It's but
now, of course, if you could have done that on a Rhodes and run that through a phaser, it would have been even better. But it was excellent on its own.
You should do the intro music to one of our episodes sometime.
Well, you guys come up. Well, how do you source you do some interesting things in your.
I make it with samples.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I know the very first episode you had some kind of it was like some born again Christian thing. Was that what that was? Some kind of some politician was talking about. Remember that? It was like some dude. I think it was one of those evangelist dudes talking about cleaning up the schools or something.
Yeah. We had I made I think I used some old recordings we had. Put them together to make the music, and then I put some. I think I had Nixon in there, Jim Jones, and
really?
And then I kind of went off the rails, and I started making a different song for every episode.
Well, that part is fun, but you did source some things that reminded me of a lot of the evangelical stuff, and of course you had the Satanic Panic and all that. That's part of that too, and.
Yeah.
Well,
another story how born again Christians took over the world, or at least the U.S. is amazing. in politics.
Actually, there's a sub. I was just gonna say there's a subtext actually to that a little bit. We do an episode on I think it was the 1980 the Norco shootout and bank robbery, and the guys who were behind that, the robbers, were part of at least one of them was part of the Jesus People movement, which was sort of like fundamentalist hippies.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. No, I mean, it is weird that things that happened 2,000, 3,000 years ago still affect everyone's life.
Well, I'm amazed at the rise to power because Frank Zappa predicted it because, as you know, you could see footage of Frank Zappa as early as 1974, worried about theocrats taking over the U.S. way back before there was a Reagan and before there was a moral majority. He's like worried this thing's going to happen. I don't know how Frank Zappa saw that coming. He got insight.
Well, I mean, there's a pendulum theory. Alex talks about it every once in a while. The pendulum always swings back and forth, order, chaos.
Yeah. It swings like England swings. Roger Miller, right? England swing. What is that song? Like the song? I don't know. Swinging London.
But I feel like I don't know that I would have seen it if I was if I was an adult during the 70s. But looking back, it's somewhat predictable. Just the excesses, and then
of course.
Well, when I think of excesses, I think of those people as the excesses. So I'll give you an example. I'd spent a year in the 70s. I had a problem staying in schools. I was kicked out of a lot of schools because I had a lot of, those are rough times, 70s. Kid. I did a year in an evangelical school, 1 year. And that was like a nightmare. I mean, I don't even begin. So I remember the principal would give sermons in the morning about the evils of the Mary Tyler Moore Show, that the Mary Tyler Moore Show was satanic, and how Mary Tyler Moore, couldn't do basically anything on her own, and how it was poisoning the minds of young women. And then the English teacher used to use expressions. The English teacher worshiped Joe Don Baker. And she was watching the show I Shied with Joe Don Baker. And her favorite movie was like, this is an English teacher. Why would an English teacher be into Joe Don Baker? And a female English teacher, no less. And she was like, I like that Joe Don Baker. She says, I like at the end of the episode, she says, you done good, boys. You done real good. When they caught the bad guy. And I'm thinking, boy, this is a different kind of way to teach English.
Yeah.
I always think of Joe Don Baker as the crooked police chief in Fletch.
Oh yeah.
It's funny. Well, he's a really good actor, and I like Walking Tall, right? And I even like My Namesake, Mitchell. As a movie, I guess. But you ever seen Mitchell?
No.
Yeah, it's a Joe Don Baker. But I don't know. I just didn't mean to go out of a tirade. But it's just one person's excess. Excess can come from different.
Well, it always people always push it too far. They push it far enough that the people who don't like that are motivated enough to push it back the other direction, and it just goes back and forth.
Because nobody knows when it's too far until it's too far.
Yeah, I mean, and
interesting.
Historically, it didn't last that long.
Mm-hmm.
By the mid '90s, it was a free for all again, and that's. Basically you can count on America to roll back and forth. No matter, you only have to wait 10 years.
Right. Matt, you have Raquel Welch on your icon here. I love it. Lon Sevi says Raquel Welch and Myra Breckenbridge, right? Is that who that is? That's who that is.
Is that what that's?
That's who that woman is, and that's the film.
Oh, it is. It is Raquel Welch. I don't know what movie it's from.
I have at least 2 early Raquel Welch books in my possession. One from the mid 70s, and one from 2 celebrity books of hers. If you're into her, that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, I love Raquel Welch. Yeah,
on the Dick Cavett show, you can see old. You guys fans of all the Dick Cavett shows they have posted on YouTube? You could see. Sly Stone and Sly and the Family Stone are on there.
Oh no.
My favorite Dick Cavett moment was when he was interviewing what's the actor's name? I'm terrible with actors' names. He always played like a tough guy, like military character.
Robert Blake?
No. In any case, he was
I'm sorry. I'm just trying to think of
he was interviewing this actor, and the actor was smoking a cigarette on the set and explaining how he killed people with his bare hands in World War II.
Oh, interesting.
And
it wasn't Chuck Heston. It was
God, no,
but someone like Chuck Heston. It was someone of that.
Yeah. Boy, I really should know who I'm talking about.
That's funny because that's kind of isn't that sort of the backstory of Father Yode, aka Jim Baker?
Yeah.
And then of course that gets turned into the Cliff Booth character backstory from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Oh yeah. Did you what Mitch? What do you think of that movie? I'm assuming you enjoyed it.
Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I love that film. I mean, I could not. Well, you guys did a really nice episode on it, right? I think it's his best film.
I agree. Yeah.
Well, he thinks he thinks it's his best film. He said that about his own film. Yeah, I think it's fantastic.
It was the only one of his movies that made me feel kind of sad.
Yeah,
you know, usually his movies are kind of like a fun ride, but
that was kind of wistful.
Yeah.
Well, it's a very mature film. It has a maturity of intelligence and emotion.
Yeah.
That a lot of the films purposefully lack, I guess, or willfully lack.
Right.
That movie is a deep film. That's a deep film about America and about it's almost, I would say that it's actually like the White Album is cinema. It's almost like Joan Didion. There's a feeling that wistfulness you talk about is what I get from reading Joe Didion's Sloshing Towards Bethlehem or White Album.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, I don't know if
then of course he wrote the novelization of it, which really just provides even more backstory and depth to it.
Yeah.
It really takes it. It's really not a novelization of the film. It's really an expansion of it in novel form.
The interesting thing about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is that I saw it in the theater twice.
Me too.
And I could tell that 70 or 80% of the audience didn't know what was going to happen because they didn't know what the story of the Manson murders. So they didn't understand the tension. You know, the movie moves day to day and you get closer and then it says that the date of the murders. And I was sitting there going, oh, this is what is going to happen. This is insane. And I could tell that nobody else felt that because they just didn't understand like what was looming over the movie.
It's a different way of experiencing the movie. It's a legitimate way. I mean, again, that's a case where a movie could yield different feeling, different. In a way, he designed his movie to be for different audiences, right? Don't you think? So those in the know and those that less in the know, or those in it works. It works for both audiences, I would guess. When you say,
yeah, I mean, I don't know how somebody who didn't know the story of the Manson murders would have experienced that, though. I feel like they wouldn't have felt the same tension, or understood like the feeling of release. Like people talk about how violent the end was, and I feel like if you didn't know the actual story, you wouldn't get like the feeling of, you know, joy that they just got slaughtered by the stuntman when they in real life.
So I'm contradicting what I said earlier. You would miss that wistful quality, right? You wouldn't, because it would be lost on you, right? It would just be, it would just be preventing these killers, right? It wouldn't mean,
right?
It wouldn't have the same meaning.
Yeah. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like our show is an attempt to provide that kind of context for people who are alive now.
You know, the episode I'm embarrassed to say I have not listened to yet, and it's because I'm really savoring it. To look for is your show on Thief with James Caan.
Yeah.
And that's one of your more recent ones, right? So
yeah,
I got to listen to that.
Yeah, that movie was great.
We referenced that. It's funny because there's nothing here to spoil for you, but the soundtrack for Thief is done by Tangerine Dream, and then we have another episode on synthesizer soundtracks. So it ends up they kind of one references the other a bit just because we bring up these different artists and the work they did in this time period. So it's interesting though, the take on it. If you have a chance, I don't know how you'll watch it or if you've already seen it and you're just waiting to see the episode, but if you get a chance, if you see the Criterion Collection DVD for Thief, it has a little featurette where they talk with one of the members of Tangerine Dream, and he kind of lays out how they sort of got tapped to do the soundtrack, and that's worth a watch. And I say this as someone who doesn't normally get a lot out of like the little bonus features on DVDs, but that's actually kind of cool.
Well, I do if it's a commentary track. I'm sure you guys do too. I mean, some great directors' commentaries. And those are
and this is really just a featurette. It's just like a half-hour interview. Just separate that they did for the disc.
I mean, that's amazing. Well, Robert, the character actor Robert Prosek, is that his name? The gangster, the what a great
the boss.
I mean, he just one of those great villains in film. I mean, just scare the shit out of you when he leans over and says, "You're mine. I own you. I can sell you, put your wife out here and sell her out to. I'm going to do this." And it's a little bit like Christopher Plummer in The Silent Partner. One of the great villains.
Yeah, and it's unexpected too.
Oh yeah,
true.
It is. Isla Thierry in The Getaway, right? You're kind of a mustachioed. It's a different kind of villain, but there's all kinds of villains. All the 70s villains and Predators are so many.
Yeah. It's funny that we did 2 films from this time period that had James Caan as the star, because I was just talking, not to Matt even, but to someone else just at work, and talking about how he didn't have I feel like he didn't have the follow, like the multi-decade after that career that other people did who got their start in the same time period, or like his contemporaries in the long 70s. Like it seems like I don't know for what reasons, but it just seems like I would have expected to see Caan more like in latter years. I mean, he was obviously in some film, but he didn't have.
Well, I from what I understand, he did have personal issues and
okay.
But then he made a comeback, I think, in the 90s, like a lot of people did, right? He did. Isn't he in The Freshman with Marlon Brando? I don't know. He does the Dogville. He does Lars von Trier uses him, and he does things like that. But I got to meet his son Scott Caan because back when back when I had money, I don't now. I had a shirt maker, and my shirt maker was the same as Scott Caan's. I was having a shirt made in New York, and I didn't know it was Scott Caan. I was talking about James Caan. He's like, he just finished rapping Hawaii Five-0. Does he still do that? I don't know. It's a show.
I don't know.
Probably not.
And he was saying he was so impressed with how much I knew about his dad. I said, "Your dad." I said, "Your dad is the greatest actor," and he got so much pride that, my dad was one of the greats.
Yeah, for sure.
Kind of masculinity on film, kind of a little bit like, I have to say, Quentin Tarantino and Brad Pitt. There's a little bit of Jimmy Caan and Brad Pitt's performance. And,
I could see it.
Mm-hmm.
Once Upon a Time, I think.
If that film had been made, however many years earlier. Totally.
That's a whole other issue. The representation of different genders and right.
Yeah. I honestly, I don't watch. I pretty much just watch movies from our time period at this point, and then here and there.
That's all you need to watch. I mean, why would you want to watch? I mean, to exaggerate, why would you want to watch anything else? I mean, is there a movie that's as good as Straight Time, or as good as or Dog Day Afternoon that's come out in the past 10 years? No, there isn't. I mean, if we're being honest, there's nothing.
Yeah,
there's nothing, or The Parallax View, or 3 Days of the Condor, or Taxi Driver. I mean, these are phenomenal movies, and they're just not. Woman Under the Influence, Chinatown, Last Detail, Coming Home. I mean, look at those movies. It's a tough act to follow.
Yeah. You could spend the rest of your life just watching 70s movies.
Oh, yeah, totally.
And be happy.
Yeah,
I'm always stashing away ones like on a queue or a watch list for you've got like a streaming service and you can kind of park stuff there, and I always feel like I'm parking more of them than I could ever watch.
So I achieved what I wanted to achieve. I've reached the Lawn 70s running time.
Oh, right.
It's now 5:20. We started at what, 3?
3
So
o'clock.
that's about 2.5 hours to that's so I think it's time that we should conclude, right? I think that's a wrap, right? That's I've honored your specifications.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Is there anything either one of you want to say before we finish, or about anything Lawn 70s or anything else? Or?
Not me. I think
Yeah.
it was a good
Thanks for
discussion.
having us on and just kind of getting the conversation started and going, and it's been fun.
It's been a lot of fun. I really appreciate your generosity of time and spirit too, because that's important.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it.
And I look forward to airing it and getting more 70s people.
Oh yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Yep. Thank you very much. And I'm
guess for
terrible.
people
I'm terrible at endings. That's why
No, I was going to say
to the ending
for
of the
people,
show.
I don't know how you normally do it, but I mean, people can find our podcast, I think, just through the normal, I'll put the shameless plug in here.
Yes.
So I think people can find our podcast just through the usual channels.
Well,
Matt is our producer of records. So is there any place in particular they should look? Or just any podcast?
Well, we have a system. So when we release this, because this is not live, this is Memorex. So because it's not Memorex is not live, when we release it, we're going to have a little thing where we have all of your information to spread the word.
Oh, cool.
Oh,
so
great.
we always do that, both verbally and do PR. So that's all built in. So I thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
And have a safe and pleasant tomorrow, as Jane Curtin would say.
You too. It was great meeting you.
All right. Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.
Take care.